Hey everyone, this is an article by Thomas Twiss titled Trotsky's Break with the Comintern, a comment on J. Getty. This was published in Soviet Studies in 1987. In a recent article in this journal by J.R. Getty examines Leon Trotsky's decision to break with the Comintern. Footnote. I would like to, J.R. Getty, Trotsky in Exile, the founding of the Fourth International. Getty dismisses as, quote, self-justifying Trotsky's own explanations for the decision and its timing, and argues that both can be better explained by the failure of Trotsky's secret strategies for a return to the leadership of the CPSU. Thus, Getty rejects the image of Trotsky as an uncompromising revolutionary fighter guided by Marxist theory and offers instead a picture of Trotsky as an opportunistic intriguer. However, a careful examination of the available evidence fails to support Getty's thesis. On the contrary, it reaffirms the importance of theory for Trotsky as a guide to and constraint upon his political behavior. Getty begins by challenging Trotsky's explanations of the 4-month delay between his break with the German Communist Party and the Comintern as a whole. On the 12th of March 1933, Trotsky first called upon his supporters to abandon their efforts to reform the KPD, motivating this proposal on the basis of that party's responsibility for the victory of fascism in Germany. Though Trotsky held the leadership of the Comintern equally responsible, Trotsky did not call for a similar break with the Comintern until mid-July. Trotsky later attributed the delay to his desire to, quote, bring about a decisive turn without leading to a split, end quote, among his supporters, especially the German Trotskyists. Also, it had been necessary, quote, to see what the influence of the German catastrophe would be on other sections of the Comintern, end quote. Trotsky. Getty discounts both explanations. Regarding the German Trotskyists, Getty argues that, quote, Trotsky had not taken them seriously enough to consult with them beforehand and had never shown much reluctance to break with the small European leftist groups which defied him, end quote. Getty. Unfortunately, Getty does not cite actual cases in which Trotsky lightly broke with groups which, quote, defied his dictates, but there is abundant evidence that Trotsky was greatly concerned about convincing his supporters of the need for a break with the KPD. Even in Trotsky's 12th of March letter, Trotsky recognized that the change would, quote, not be absorbed all at once by all our comrades, end quote. Trotsky. And in the ensuing months, Trotsky submitted several contributions to the internal discussion of the international left opposition in which he argued for a new orientation in Germany. Footnote. See Trotsky, The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany, published in 1971. Part of the reason Trotsky was so concerned about convincing his supporters was his conviction that they could be convinced. Also, the German Trotskyists had just voted to reaffirm their old position. Trotsky wanted to avoid giving the impression that the leadership of the international left opposition was forcing a new position on the organization against the will of the organization's members. However, Trotsky clearly did not believe that either the central or national leaderships would voluntarily initiate a reform of the Comintern. As in past years, Trotsky placed his hopes on the pressure which the rank-and-file membership might exert within the sections. Now Trotsky considered it possible that outrage over the consequences of the Comintern's ultra-left course in Germany would contribute to such pressure. Far from, quote, expecting this to occur, Trotsky was explicitly quite pessimistic. Still, Trotsky was unwilling to break with the Comintern until this, quote, theoretical possibility had been exhausted. Footnote. Retrospectively, we can see that Trotsky's hopes were futile, but prior to the 1st of April declaration by the Presidium of the IKKI that the line of the KPD has been, quote, completely correct, end quote, there appeared to be signs the Comintern was renouncing its, quote, third period line in favor of a united front with Social Democrats. C.E.H. Carr, The Twilight of the Comintern, 1930-35. And, unknown to Trotsky, even after the 1st of April declaration, Clement Gottwald of Czechoslovakia appealed to the IKKI for a united front. Similar views were expressed within the French and Austrian sections. Again, see Carr, Twilight of the Comintern. End footnote. Having summarily disposed of Trotsky's explanations, Getty attempts to account for the delay in terms of two, quote, secret strategies allegedly employed by Trotsky to regain power. The first involves a letter of the 15th of March 1933, which Trotsky addressed to the Politburo of the CPSU. In Getty's view, this was a, quote, remarkable secret letter, end quote, containing a, quote, remarkable offer, end quote. Getty claims that Trotsky was actually asking the Moscow leadership to recall him to power in exchange for his promise that the left opposition would refrain from criticism altogether. For Getty, the secrecy of Trotsky's letter can be explained by the contradiction between the letter's proposals and Trotsky's previous demands. Getty portrays Trotsky's 12th March break with the KPD as largely a ploy to put pressure on Moscow to take him back rather than face a split in the Comintern. He argues that Trotsky signed his call for a break with the KPD as, quote, Gurov, in order to maintain the option of disavowing this action if recalled to power. In fact, it is not Trotsky's letter so much as Getty's interpretation of Trotsky's letter that can be characterized as, quote, remarkable. First, there is no basis for depicting it as a self-serving attempt to return to the Moscow leadership. If Trotsky's sole purpose in writing the letter was to get the leadership to recall him to power, one would expect Trotsky to pose this question clearly in a secret letter to the Politburo. Footnote. Previously, Trotsky had stated openly his support under certain conditions for the slogan of a coalition central committee. End footnote. However, at no point in the letter did Trotsky even mention this. The letter demanded only, quote, the opportunity for normal work within the party, end quote, Trotsky, for the left opposition. As Trotsky later publicly explained, his letter to the Politburo had only reiterated the long-standing position of the left opposition, quote, we were and we still are entirely at the service of the Soviet Republic, and we are prepared to carry out any work in the Soviet Republic's interests, end quote. Trotsky. For earlier statements of this position, see Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1929, page 341, and Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1932, page 125-26. Trotsky also repeated this position 2 weeks after his letter to the Politburo. End footnote. Nor did the letter contain major new concessions regarding party discussion. Trotsky's proposal for a, quote, preliminary agreement, end quote, was only an offer to negotiate the mechanics of a party discussion in the context of an explosive situation within the USSR. It is possible that Trotsky would have been willing to negotiate the timing of the discussion, but there is no indication that Trotsky was willing to delay it indefinitely or to refrain from criticism altogether. In fact, Trotsky's public statements immediately before and after the letter suggest just the opposite. In these, Trotsky insisted that the only way to save the Soviet Union from collapse was through a serious discussion with open criticism, platforms, factional groups, and an emergency party Congress. Would Trotsky have argued so forcefully for an open discussion if Trotsky was secretly preparing to abandon such a discussion altogether? It is not surprising, then, that Getty is also mistaken in his claim that Trotsky attempted to keep his proposal for a, quote, preliminary agreement from his supporters. On the 30th of March, Trotsky wrote an article in which he noted that, quote, mutual criticism, bracket, within the CPSU, end bracket, ... may have a different character depending on the extent to which it is consciously prepared by both sides and in what organizational framework it takes place, end quote. Trotsky. In an attempt to have it both ways, Getty describes these as, quote, cryptic remarks, designed to prepare Trotsky's followers for Moscow's acceptance of his offer. But Trotsky goes beyond these, quote, cryptic remarks in the next sentence, where he explicitly calls for a, quote, agreement between the left opposition and the party leadership. And again in the concluding paragraph, Trotsky blurts out his proposal for a, quote, inter-party agreement, end quote, and, quote, an honorable agreement before the eyes of the party and of the international proletariat, end quote. The title of the article is, quote, we need an honest inter-party agreement, end quote. It is true that Trotsky never published his 15th of March letter, but it is not necessary to look for contradictions with his previous proposals to explain this. In the letter, Trotsky explained that its restricted circulation was designed, quote, to allow the necessary freedom in the choice of methods if, ... it is considered necessary to enter into preliminary talks without any publicity, end quote. When Trotsky concluded on the 10th of May that there would be no reply from the Politburo, there was no further need for secrecy. Thus, 3 days later, he wrote a brief but accurate summary of its contents for publication. Oh, there's a footnote I missed. It says, Trotsky summarized this article. Wait, did I ever say this? I don't know, I'm fucking spacing out. I'll read it anyway. Trotsky summarized this article in a 12th of April letter to a supporter. Quote, for Germany, we say the Communist Party is dead, but for the USSR, we propose an agreement with the top circle of the party, end quote. Trotsky. End footnote. Trotsky never bothered to publish the letter itself, probably because the appeal soon lost all of its political significance with his renunciation of a reform perspective for the Communist Party Soviet Union. Furthermore, it is simply inconceivable that Trotsky would have imagined that a break with the KPD could pressure the Moscow leadership into taking him back rather than face a split in the Comintern. The great majority of Trotsky's supporters are already outside the Comintern, having been expelled from their respective parties in previous years. As Trotsky fully understood from the point of view of the Moscow leadership, and the split had been consummated long before. Nor could Trotsky have hoped to maintain the option of disavowing, quote, Gurov's break with the Comintern. For in the same period that, quote, Gurov called for a break with the KPD, Trotsky repeatedly published statements of the same position under his own name. Footnote. Statements of this position published under Trotsky's name prior to 10th of May include the tragedy of the German proletariat, the article KPD or New Party, signed Trotsky, and the collapse of the KPD and the tasks of the opposition. From 1929 to 1934, Trotsky signed at least 24 articles and letters G. Gurov, or variations of that pseudonym. These include the 2 July 1933 articles in which Trotsky called for a break with the Comintern. End footnote. The second of the, quote, secret strategies, end quote, Getty attributes to Trotsky involves a bloc of diverse groupings of oppositionists established in the Soviet Union in 1932, with Trotsky's support. Getty claims that this bloc provides the key to Trotsky's continued reluctance to break with the Comintern after his letter to the Politburo failed to elicit a response. However, when he learned that Zinoviev and Kamenev had capitulated to Stalin, Getty's Trotsky was forced to abandon his hopes for a speedy return to Moscow. Soon after, Trotsky broke with the Comintern. Footnote. See Getty, page 31. It should first be noted that there is nothing here to support Getty's insinuation that Trotsky's support for the bloc was motivated by personal ambition as opposed to the goal of reforming the Communist Party Soviet Union. It is likely that Trotsky hoped the bloc eventually would become a political force within the party. If the bloc could be persuaded to adopt all or part of the program of the left opposition, it could become an instrument for pressuring the leadership to reform the party. Among other demands, the bloc might have pressed for the return of all expelled oppositionists, including Trotsky, to the party. But then the left opposition had always seen their readmission as a necessary part of the process of reform. This is the valid kernel in Getty's observation that, quote, it is almost as if Trotsky equated reform of the party with his return to it, end quote. Parenthesis, it would seem that for Getty, on the other hand, any genuine attempt by Trotsky to reform the party had to exclude Trotsky's own return to it, end parenthesis. The point here is not that Trotsky lacked personal ambitions, but that there was no basis for believing Trotsky was pursuing those ambitions in contradiction to his stated ideals or cynically redefining those ideals to correspond to his personal interests. A second problem involves Getty's assertion that Trotsky gave up on the bloc as a consequence of the capitulation of Zinoviev and Kamenev. This is one possibility, parenthesis, if not for the reasons suggested by Getty, end parenthesis. Footnote. Getty implies that Zinoviev and Kamenev were indispensable leaders, arguing that their capitulation, quote, decapitated the 1932 bloc. If they were indispensable, quote, decapitated the 1932 bloc, end quote. Getty. If they were indispensable, the bloc should have been destroyed by their arrest in 1932. Parenthesis, inconsistently, Getty also refers to their arrest and the arrest of other opposition leaders in the autumn of 1932 as the, quote, decapitation of the bloc, end quote. However, many remaining hopes Trotsky held for the bloc may have been destroyed by the capitulations if Trotsky viewed them as evidence of demoralization within the opposition. Trotsky's son later described the capitulations in this way. See Leon Sadov, The Red Book on the Moscow Trial, published in 1980. End footnote. But it is equally likely that prospects of the bloc were destroyed months before by the arrest of a large number of oppositions during the autumn and winter of 1932 to 33. Footnote. This is the conclusion of Pierre Brouet, the first scholar to discover the existence of the 1932 bloc. End footnote. More problematic for Getty is the delay between the capitulations and Trotsky's break with the Comintern. The whole purpose of Getty's discussion of the bloc is to explain the delay between Trotsky's 10th of May communication with the Politburo and his decision to form a new international. Even if Trotsky gave up on the bloc when he heard of the capitulations, this accounts for just 13 days, leaving more than 7 weeks unexplained. Footnote, Getty attempts to fill the 7-week gap by reference to, quote, a bitter article against Zinoviev, end quote, written on the 6th of July, 1933, in which Trotsky, quote, railed against, end quote, the capitulators, and, quote, denounced their capitulations in strong terms, end quote. Getty. Getty completely misrepresents the character of this statement, but more importantly, reference to this statement does nothing to explain the 7-week delay. End footnote. Getty's attempts to account for the 4-month delay and his objections to Trotsky's own explanations collapse under examination. This does not mean, however, that there are not other explanations which supplement Trotsky's. One, which includes a portion of Getty's argument that is valid, returns us to the ground of theory abandoned by Getty at the outset. For years, Trotsky had based his refusal to break with the Comintern largely upon the fact that masses of revolutionary workers remained loyal to the parties of the International. On the one hand, Trotsky argued that this provided a means of reforming the Comintern. On the other hand, it foredoomed any new international to an isolated and sectarian existence. Only a, quote, great historic event, end quote, could shake the confidence of revolutionary workers in the Comintern and open up prospects for a fourth international. Trotsky's insistence upon a reform perspective for the CPSU, however, contained an additional element. Trotsky argued that it was impermissible to break with the Communist Party Soviet Union as long as it remained the ruling party of a worker state. This presented a potential dilemma. What position would Trotsky take if a, quote, great historic event, end quote, demonstrated the political bankruptcy of the Comintern, but a capitalist state did not come to power in the Soviet Union? How could Trotsky break with the Comintern without also breaking with the Communist Party Soviet Union? Prior to March 1933, the question was not sharply posed. In previous years, Trotsky had envisaged that either the collapse of the Soviet workers' state or the victory of fascism in Germany would necessitate the formation of a new international. But a fascist victory, Trotsky argued, would greatly increase the possibility or even probability of the restoration of capitalism in the USSR. Only when Trotsky had concluded that fascism had decisively triumphed in Germany was Trotsky confronted with the dilemma. Trotsky immediately called for a break with the KPD, but Trotsky balked at the prospect of abandoning the Comintern. One of Trotsky's secretaries later recalled that the greatest obstacle in Trotsky's mind to a break with the Comintern at this point was Trotsky's view that the Soviet Union remained a worker state. Footnote, see Jean van Huysenoort, How the Fourth International was Conceived. End footnote. This is also confirmed by Trotsky's own writings from the period. In his initial call for a break with the KPD, Trotsky rejected a similar rupture with the Comintern, partially because Trotsky saw the slogan of a second party as incorrect for the Soviet Union. And in subsequent articles, Trotsky implied that the founding of a new international would be permissible, only if the Stalinists brought the Soviet Union to ruin. Trotsky initially attempted to avoid the dilemma, given the possibility that it would be resolved by reality. Thus, Trotsky waited to see if the German catastrophe would spur communists in the West to reform the International, and Trotsky continued to hope that the CPSU and the Soviet state could be reformed. Trotsky appealed to the Politburo one final time on the chance that the economic and political crises in the USSR and Hitler's victory in Germany might force the leadership to revive the party. It is also possible, Trotsky still believed, that the discontent which had inspired the opposition bloc might develop into a movement for party reform. More pessimistically, Trotsky feared that the economic crisis in the Soviet Union would lead to a restoration of capitalism. By the summer of 1933, it became clear that neither Trotsky's most optimistic hopes nor Trotsky's worst fears were about to materialize in the near future. Trotsky now argued in private discussions with his supporters for a break with all the parties of the Comintern except the CPSU. But such a position was clearly untenable, given the fact that the Comintern was controlled by the leadership of the CPSU. Soon afterwards, Trotsky called upon his supporters to abandon the entire Comintern. As Getty notes, quote, Trotsky was a politician as well as a political analyst, end quote. But more than perhaps any other politician, Trotsky was guided and constrained in Trotsky's political activities by theoretical considerations. It is through an understanding of Trotsky's theoretical framework, not alleged attempts to regain personal power, that we can best understand Trotsky's hesitation to break with the Comintern in the spring of 1933. Thomas Twiss, University of Pittsburgh. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.